Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Shut Up David series. Today, I'm delighted to have with me Greg Smith. Greg is a highly respected lawyer at Jackson McDonald Lawyers based here in Perth, Western Australia. Got over 2 decades of experience in the legal profession. Greg has established himself as a leading authority in the areas of workplace safety, risk management, and regulatory compliance. So bear with me a bit at the moment. I'm feeling a little bit crook, so my voice might give out at some point, but we'll keep on going. Greg's experience extends far beyond the courtroom. He's a sought-after consultant, advising organizations across various industries on navigating the complex landscape of safety regulations and implementing robust risk management systems. His deep understanding of the legal intricacies surrounding workplace safety has made him a valuable resource for businesses seeking to mitigate risks and ensure compliance. In addition to his legal practice, voice nearly went then, Greg has authored several books, including Paper Safe, which quickly became a must-read for any safety professional serious about improving safety. His recently published book, Proving Safety, has garnered widespread acclaim for its insightful critique of traditional safety metrics and its exploration of the challenges organizations face in demonstrating effective safety management. So you can see why we've got him here on the channel today to talk to me and to share his wisdom and insights with everyone who subscribes and who'll be listening to this. So without much ado, let me bring him onto the stage and welcome him. Greg, lovely to have you on the channel, mate.
Thanks, David. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here. Good to have a chat.
No worries.
And thank you for the very kind introduction. Sitting in the background listening to that. Thank you.
It's going back about 10 or 15 videos now. I didn't realize when I drop people down to the holding area, they can still hear me. Yeah. And then one of my guests came up and said, "Oh, you might want to change that bit of the intro and everything." I said, "Well, it's a bit late now." I said, "But can you hear me?" And they're like, "Yeah, we can hear what you're saying." I'm like, "Oh God." So I just try to block you out now and just kind of put that in there. Thank you for coming on, mate.
That's all right. Pleasure.
Just so people are aware as well, to fill in a bit of context, obviously Greg and I are both here in Perth, Western Australia. Our paths cross quite frequently at safety social events here in Perth, and I've seen Greg give many a talk and turn up at many Australian Institute of Health and Safety event and speak and help safety leaders here in Australia with coming to terms with their obligations, how they're going to try and prove those, and some misconceptions about, well, particularly if we're talking about Paper Safe, around the misplaced confidence that can come from an overinflated safety management system.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, I think that's fair.
So why don't we start off, Greg? You've just obviously released your recent book, which is Proving Safety. And that challenges the traditional safety metrics like injury rates. What alternative approaches do you propose that organizations have to demonstrate effective safety management?
So the fundamental thesis, I guess, in the book, David, is to say that there isn't a metric. There's not a measure. There's not a number. If there was, I remember talking to Mary Conquest on her podcast a while ago. If there was a number, so lawyers have been grappling with workplace health and safety for decades. We're the ones who get brought in. There's been the fatality or the incident or whatever it's been, and we're trying to help the organisation resolve it. And so for decades, we've been grappling with this question: how do we demonstrate? And so if there was a number, if there was a metric, if there was something we could put up in front of the court and say, Your Honour, this is what my client measures, and that's the evidence that they're doing everything reasonably practicable to manage the risks, it would be out there in the public. It'd be out there by now, okay? Because we don't, as lawyers, we don't turn our mind to it in the way that academic researchers do, and so there's this slight disconnect between evidencing legal compliance on the one hand and understanding if your workers are working safely or if your workplace is safe. They're not identical questions, but they have a very, very strong overlap. And and again, I say this in the book, one of the things I strongly believe is that if organisations properly understood and evidenced legal compliance, not what people think legal compliance is, but proper legal compliance, they would be going a long way to evidencing safe workplaces. So if we are prepared to accept that there's not a number, and that's not to say there's not a place for numbers. So if you are counting injury rate data, there's a place for that. So if you understand the types of injuries you're having in your organisation, you can address those types of injuries. It's just not evidence that your systems are effective. Okay, and the same can be true for any metric. So my central view is we need to move away from a number. Health and safety is fundamentally an advisory role, in my view. We need to be providing advice to our organisations or clients, and that should be based on looking at the critical risks in the business and saying, this is what we've done to check if they're being managed effectively. It moves to a narrative reporting the framework as opposed to counting numbers of injuries or numbers of inspections or those sorts of things.
Yeah, right, okay. It is a big wicked problem, as you mentioned in the book, isn't it? It's and a couple of things came to mind when you were talking about why do you think there is such a big divide between the academic view of professions, of topics, of subjects, and the legal view? Why is there such a big divide in the safety field? And also as well, if there had been a solution by now, as you mentioned at the beginning, that solution people would be doing it, but there isn't an effective solution so far. Do you think that maybe that's because the actual word safety it has a million different definitions and different meanings? So you've got compliance safety, you've got psychosocial safety, you've got process safety, you've got design safety, all these different types of safety. And they, with compliance safety, you'd have a very strong argument, I think, to say, look, quantitative data is the kind of thing you should be collecting, and you should be ticking those boxes, and you should be meeting your compliance. When we're talking about human safety, those same tools don't really work as well. Is that a fair comment, do you think?
Yes and no. So there's a couple of things to unpack from that. So first of all, why is there a disconnect between safety research and legal risk management, to phrase it that way? I think it's simply because safety research doesn't turn its mind to legal risk management. And I don't think if I'm a safety researcher, if I'm working, at the Safety Innovation Lab at Griffith University, and I'm a sociologist or an engineer or a psychologist or whatever my background, my job is not to understand and provide legal compliance exercises. That's not what I'm looking at. Now, I think there could be much greater collaboration between the safety science and legal risk management, but I think there could be much greater collaboration across a whole range of professions and skill sets in safety to come up with more holistic solutions. So I think that's you can put that to one side to some extent. Now there was the last part of your question. Sorry, it's just dropped out of my mind because I was.
It's the definition of safety. Do you think that's why we're having such difficult time coming up with adequate tools or assessment methodologies?
Well, I think in some ways yes, and in some ways no. So I think what safety looks like from a design engineering perspective probably looks different from what safety means to a frontline supervisor overlooking a work crew. They're probably two different things. But again, from a legal risk management perspective, we're having the same conversation. Do you have proper systems to manage the risks? Are they in place and effective? And I look to your observation you made before about and I think you referred to it as quantitative sort of safety assessments, which I think is sort of another way of talking about what came off the back of the BP Texas City refinery explosion when they started creating this distinction between process and personal safety. Yeah. But even it's an interesting conversation, because if you go back to Texas City, one of the issues in that case that arose, or in that disaster, was there was a checking process before the raffinate splitter tower was due to restart. And it involved a checklist of going around checking valves and gauges and indicators systems.
Yep.
So that theoretically is a process safety, a very quantitative. It's not qualitative, it's not subjective. You go and check the valves and gauges and are they working?
Yep.
But it still requires someone to do the check. And so in that case, the finding that came out of the commission was the person was doing the check and the supervisor came along and said, we haven't got time to finish doing the checklist. So he initialed everything as done and signed it. And the failure of the gauges to measure the level of hydrocarbons in the raffinate splitter tower, feed that information back to the control room, was a critical failure path in the disaster. So
Gotcha.
even if you're talking about that kind of process checking that you can objectively check, somebody still has to check it diligently and honestly and properly.
Yes. Yeah.
If you go to Piper Alpha, there was observations in the Piper Alpha case, like the Lord Cullen's review of Piper Alpha, when they talked about the failure of the permit to work system. So the permit to work system failed, critical path, contribution to the disaster. And the process was that the permit to work system and safety people, as it was described in the Royal Commission, the safety people on the facility were meant to monitor the permit to work system. But the Royal Commission observed that nobody was checking the quality of the monitoring.
Gotcha.
So
this goes back to a conversation I had with Ray Gonzalez last week, or the week before, where he proposed that humans in the system are critical controls.
Yeah, I suspect so.
Are probably the most critical control you can have, especially when a human needs to be involved in the process of safety, or in the act of safety.
But even accepting that, the question I think you run into as an organisation is checkers checking the checkers checking the checkers. So at what point? So there's a case, New South Wales decision called Prospect Electricity, that talks about the infinite regression of supervision.
Mm-hmm.
So at what point institutionally do you draw a line under your process and say, we're satisfied this works?
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that I think is interesting in this area is that we don't, well, as far as I can tell, organisations don't aggregate evidence to tell them that their systems are working. So nobody gets an annual report or a quarterly report that says, we have gone and analysed our permit to work system in practice, and we are confident that it is well understood and that it is being implemented correctly, so that you, organisation/board, when you get a report that says permits to work, the correct number of permits to work have been done, or the traffic light for permits to work is green, you can be confident that that means the system's working, because this is the analysis we've done of the system.
Yeah.
And you could take your permit to work, incident investigations, JHA, safe work method statement, training and competence, contractor safety management, management change, any of those systems issues. We set them up, we run them, and we don't have that formal research project that comes back to the organisation and says, we've checked and monitored and this is what we've done, and based on our checking and monitoring, you can be confident in the data you're receiving. Yeah. And that's probably, I think, where we need to invest a bit of time and energy.
Yeah, right. So that it's that confirmation that what we are doing is working and is effective.
And then this swings back to the safety literacy of the organisation, and in particular its leaders, to question safety management in their organisation at a systemic level. So when something goes wrong, we have a near miss or we have an incident in the organisation, that should cause us. So if we're getting information from our organisation that tells us things are working and something goes wrong, that should cause us to question, well, hang on, this is contrary to what we've been told. But the questioning needs to be at a systemic level, not an event level. So
Gotcha.
you had an event, say a dropped object or whatever it is, near miss, actual injury. We need, at an executive level, we need to be less concerned about the circumstances of that specific incident, because we've got operational management who can deal with the circumstances of the specific incident. Okay, we need to be more concerned about what does that incident tell us more broadly about the efficacy of our systems
Systemically.
Yeah, and we've got to raise the questioning needs to be raised up through the organisation.
If you had your own company, 1,000 employees, you're a mining contractor or manufacturer, whatever it is, and you had 1,000 employees and they were all doing, well, obviously you got your office staff to a degree, but a large majority of your people were doing things that were putting them in the line of risk. How would people know from looking at your organization from the outside that it's different to how organizations are currently dealing with safety? What would they see that would be different?
Or if I was given a free rein, and I sit on some audit and risk committees, so I have these conversations, there would be less layering of process. So, for example, I wouldn't be imposing on the workforce safe work procedure, safe work method statement, JHA, take 5. There would be, I would try to say, what's the purpose of all of those tools? Well, the purpose is to inform the frontline workforce and give them what they need to deal with the risks that they're confronted. I would try to just create one tool for that process. That would be one thing, I think. I would try to move away from, and if I'm a mining contractor, I probably wouldn't have this option because I'd be fighting with my clients all the time. But in a perfect world, I wouldn't have any metrics around safety performance. Like I wouldn't have metrics around, so for example, I wouldn't have metrics around the number of management conversations that my management team held.
Gotcha.
Rather, I would make them accountable for safety in their area of responsibility, and I would test the efficacy of safety management in their area of responsibility. And if it wasn't up to the organisational expectation, I would hold them accountable to that. I wouldn't hold them accountable for the number of inspections they've done. I would hold them accountable for, the understanding of safety in their organisation. So that would be something I think I would do differently. I think I would try to have far more. I think I would do far less incident investigations, and try to do. I would shift incident investigations from a data collection exercise with deep dives into themes. So I would create a checklist that said we've had an incident. Check. Very basic checklist about what do we understand from this incident, and I would use that to create themes around the critical risks in the business and critical systems, and then I would commission deep dive inquiries into those critical themes, as opposed to spinning off hundreds and hundreds of minor corrective actions with little impact. Similarly for audits, I would try very hard to move audits away from understanding the mechanics of what were in place to deep dive inquiries into whether the risks were being managed on the ground. I think that would be something I would invest heavily in. And I would invest heavily in ongoing critical analysis of the key safety management systems elements of the business, not on an incident by incident basis, but deep dive thematic investigations. The phraseology I use in the improving safety is turning safety basically into a permanent research project, not collecting data or metrics, just this ongoing permanent checking and researching in the organisation.
I like that. That speaks to a lot of approaches with continual learning, really, doesn't it? Continual development.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. The key sort of themes I touch on improving safety is doing less but doing it better. I think that's really important, with a focus on intent. Why are we doing it? And a focus on criticality, to me, would be important. In Australia at the moment, David, I think it's a bit, the waters have become a bit muddied because of this current surge in concern over psychosocial risk and what that means. I think lots and lots of organisations are actually distracted from critical risk because of the sudden spotlight, I guess, on psychosocial risk. So that's a problematic issue as well, just at the minute. I'm not sure we've approached that issue in the best way possible. That's going to take some time to play out.
How so? How could we have approached it better?
Well, I think it strikes me that the approach to psychosocial risk was something of a knee-jerk reaction. And I mean, it's always been there. It's always been part of the legislation. It's always been part of the regulation. But I just feel it was an opportunity lost, because a large part of the complexity of psychosocial regulation is the number of jurisdictions that it sits in. So you've got, the Fair Work Commission can issue stop bullying and stop sexual harassment orders. You've got the new the positive powers of the Human Rights Commission to investigate sexual harassment in workplaces, and the new positive duty to prevent sexual harassment. You've always had the workers' compensation element around psychosocial harm. You've always had a common law element. I mean, there's a case, I've talked about this before, there's a case going up to the High Court called Vision Australia and Elisha, which talks about a person's ability to claim damages for psychosocial harm caused by an unfair termination process.
Mm-hmm.
And that case is going to be, that decision currently is based on a 1909 UK King's Bench decision called Adidas Gramophone, or Gramophone, right? So it's been around for more than 100 years as a legal issue. So it's not new.
Yeah.
But what we haven't done is step back and said, what is the best way to manage this as an issue from a jurisdictional perspective? Now, I doubt that we would come up with a perfect answer, but it strikes me that work health and safety legislation is not the right place to deal with it.
Gotcha.
And I think there would have been a really good argument that could have been made for identifying what we mean by psychosocial risk and creating a special division within the Fair Work Commission, for example. Something that would have, so we've got national coverage, one regulator dealing with it instead of each state dealing with it in its own way, one tribunal that covers it all off. I just think that might have been more helpful. We could have created better approaches. I mean, one of the things organisations are grappling with is how do we protect complainants if we must do a work health and safety investigation? You can't. It's difficult to protect anonymity. It's difficult to protect the complainant's wishes. There's just a lot of issues around it that I think are going to undermine the success of what we're trying to achieve here. And I think there are better ways we could have done it.
So you almost have the snake biting its own tail there by saying, look, we need to effectively investigate this potential serious issue, but we also need to effectively protect the individuals and their psychosocial harm that might come about through this investigation process.
Yeah, and it's not an easy. I'm not pretending for a second, David, that it's an easy balance. So, one of the issues that has historically been the case is that if I come to you as a complainant because I've been sexually harassed or bullied, and I just need someone to talk to. I don't want an investigator. I just need you to know, look, this is happening. Can you keep an eye out for it or something like that?
Yep.
The organisation had a discretion to do that. Now, on one view of the world, I think this is perfectly correct, that discretion was too large. And so we saw that in the Enough is Enough report in sexual misconduct in the WA mining industry, where there's a lot of criticisms of mining companies not necessarily covering it up, but shifting people around, making payouts and those sorts of things, and not having to really deal with the issue. So I accept that the discretion creates a problem at one end of the spectrum. But if you remove that discretion completely and at the other end of the spectrum, you create a different set of problems.
Mm-hmm.
And I know through my own engagement with people that there are people who are still leaving organisations rather than report concerns about behaviour because they don't want to be involved in the investigation process.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a concern that people are telling me has been exacerbated because it might get reported to WorkSafe.
Yeah.
And look, all of our skill sets in this might improve over time. We might get better at it. But my immediate sense is we're involved in an extraordinary amount of activity, but not necessarily doing a lot of good.
Okay. And I see when you're talking there, I see the inherent problem with that. And that kind of leads me on to my next question here, which is related to the book as well, which is around worker insights and around the reliability of the information you get there, the safety metrics that you get from worker insights. Can you speak to us a bit about the potential pitfalls and how the organizations can ensure such processes provide meaningful insights from worker insights?
So I spoke, improving safety, I spoke about worker insights in the context of the due diligence index, but I'm not for 1 second saying that the due diligence index is unique here. The history of safety management has this very long pedigree of saying we need feedback from the workforce to understand how things are actually happening in the front line. So whether it's hazard reporting, safe act observations, safety conversations, there's probably a million different versions of what we're talking about. And I do not disagree for 1 second that it is very important that we create those mechanics and processes for that feedback to occur.
Yep.
We need to understand if our processes are not fit for purpose. We need to understand if a job has changed over time so that the resources we used to use for the job are now no longer sufficient.
Yep.
So, and this is where I think the work by people like Clive Lloyd and others who are very much focused in that we have to build trust, we have to build relationships to create the conversations, yada, yada, yada. Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think that's really important. And the how we do that is interesting, but it's multifaceted. So, for example, if we're saying, if one of the tools we're going to use that is a management conversation, for example, where we send managers out to have conversations with workers, then there's a whole lot of stuff that goes into that. The managers have got to be properly equipped to have the conversation. They need to understand what the current system says about the work they're observing. They need to understand what they need to know what they're talking about, or they need to have a subject matter expert. So there needs to be that is part of it.
Yep.
There's an additional complexity on top of that, in that how do we then aggregate up that information? So if you've got 100 management conversations happening a month, how do we aggregate that and analyze it and say, what have we learned from those conversations? All right. Is there a risk that manager A is looking at work group A and implements a solution which is inconsistent with manager B and work group B, and all of a sudden we get inconsistent work happening across the organization? It's not unusual. At the moment, it seems that, and this is part of the reporting problem, the way that data is captured is simply as a traffic light in a monthly report that says the correct number of conversations have been had.
100 conversations were had across the organization. Tick.
So that's one issue. If the other way of doing it is through worker hazard reporting, for example, then again, one of the problems with that is we put a metric on it and say everybody's got to put in 2 hazard reports a shift. All right, we know how that leads. We know what that leads to, and we also know, again, we have an analysis question. So what the reporting isn't, we've analysed 150 hazard reports. This is the trend. It's 150 hazard reports have been done, green traffic light, tick.
Yeah.
And so you go back to Lord Robins, and which is what our legislation is based on, out of the 70s. He talks about the critical role of supervision. And I think every time I end up having a conversation about safety, we end up having a conversation about supervisors. Supervisors play a critical role in safety management. They are the link between the shop floor and managers. And fundamentally, it is their job to understand what is going on and to communicate that and give the insight to the management group. But it seems to me that the way organisations have developed over time has really effectively neutered supervisors. I mean, a lot of them now are just glorified administrators who are form filling, data collecting. I think Dave Provan and Drew Ray talk about this idea of discretionary time. Who do we want to give more discretionary time to? If we want to understand safety in our organisations, I think to understand safety, I don't think we need managers going out and having management conversations. We certainly don't need to be counting them. Managers should be going out and having conversations with their workers for the purpose of having conversations with their workers. Yeah. Understand what's going on and get not to be part of understanding safety. If we want to understand safety, I think we need to give a lot more discretionary time back to our safety personnel, and probably more. I still got you, David?
You dropped out for a second, but you're back, I think. Yep. You can't hear me, but if I stick my thumb up.
I can see you and you're back. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. We dropped out.
Yeah, that's all good.
So what I was saying, much more discretionary time back to our safety. So our safety people, we should stop using them as data collection robots. That shouldn't be their job anymore. And particularly for our frontline supervisors, it should be far more discretionary time to be on the ground, understanding what's going on, talking to the workers, getting a sense of all of that. And the management conversations to understand what is going on should be with supervisors and their safety teams. What's happening, what's going on. And, if they're getting insights from their safety management team and insights from their supervisors, then they can go and confirm those insights during their safety conversations.
Yeah.
But don't count them. Stop counting these activities.
I think, Greg, some of that might have come by. I was just thinking, and you're absolutely right when you say the supervisors have effectively become neutered. I've spoken to hundreds of supervisors, I'm sure you have, in multiple different organizations here in Australia. And they are one of the most work burdened group of people in an organization. Everything seems to get pushed into this role of supervisor. And if you look at some of the things that they're required to do, there's no way you could effectively manage that in a day. And safety is obviously a critical part of that as well. So you've got all this requirement, all of this expectation that's placed on them, put in here, and they're going to find the quickest, easiest way to get through their list of things to do. And if that means, yes, I've been out and done that, yes, I've had that conversation and had that tick and flick response because of the workload that they've got, can we really blame them? And this goes back to your point, about providing this discretionary time. Yes, we're going to give you back discretionary time, but that discretionary time is so that you can add quality to what you're doing as opposed to add more things to what you're doing. Is that what you? Is that effectively what you're saying there?
Yeah, and this is my view of the sort of doing less but better. I'm not saying, and I've never said, get rid of all administration in safety. But I do think there is a compelling case for getting rid of a lot of administration in safety.
Yeah, same.
And understanding what the organisational expectation is. So, again, you take something as ubiquitous as Take 5s. What is it we're actually trying to achieve through a Take 5 process?
Mm-hmm.
As I understand it, it is a tool that we want frontline workers to use so that they understand the hazards associated with their work and how they're going to manage those hazards, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if that's the expectation, then that's what we should be using discretionary time to test and measure through conversation. Okay, do our workers understand the hazards and that they're associated, they're engaging with when they do that? You don't need a piece of paper to do that. You don't need a checklist. Look, for some tasks, it might help. There might be specific high-risk tasks that are not done on a regular basis where it would be helpful to have a document that says, pay attention to these things.
Yeah, like pilots.
Yeah, pilots and surgeons and things like that. There are critical things you want to pay attention to. But we don't. In safety, at least, this is not just safety. You see it in a lot of things. We don't seem to be prepared to invest the intellectual capital to say what activities do we need that for.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit like everybody who's outside must wear a hard hat.
Yeah,
we're not prepared to say let's make a value judgment when you have to wear a hard hat.
Yeah,
it's a bit the same for JHAs and Take 5s and all these sorts of things, and even incident investigations. Right?
Yeah,
it's very simplistic. We say we have to investigate everything. No, we don't, but we have. That's what we say, and we categorize how we investigate based on a very simplistic binary of consequence or potential consequence.
5 by 5, whatever it is.
But not on what is the opportunity that arises from this incident.
Mm-hmm.
So let's do a preliminary assessment. There's probably not much we can get from this. Let's collect a bit of data that we can use to build the sort of themes that I talked about before, but let's not invest time and energy on a detailed investigation. That will suck time and discretionary, because most of the time supervisors and safety are the people doing that. So again, they're losing their discretionary time. Most of the corrective actions will fall on lower management or frontline supervisors, again,
mm-hmm.
overburdening them, taking away from their discretionary time.
Yeah.
It just needs to be more of an intellectual exercise as opposed to this mechanistic, process-driven.
So the word that's coming to mind when I hear you talking, and I agree with you completely, because I've been on mine sites, and this one particular mine site I was on, a guy in a loader had the window open. It was ajar. It wasn't fully open. It was like a barn door style one, so they hinged at the top, and he had it slightly ajar. He had his hand where the window would close. You can see what's going to happen. As he was turning around to make sure no one's around him, a gust of wind blew the window shut, and it bruised his finger. I think it might have actually fractured the end of his finger. Yeah. I was sat in a 5-hour incident investigation meeting after that with the management team, because they wanted to make sure that this type of thing never happened again. And it was ridiculous, because it was a gust of wind on a window, and that was 5 hours of, there would have been 15 people involved in that incident investigation. But the word that came to me when you were talking about having this discretionary time and applying a set of logic as to what we do with what happens is we need to be better at discriminating.
Yeah.
And it's a nasty word nowadays, isn't it? You can't say it, but I think it's true. I think we need to discriminate between what happens and what we do about it. Do we apply this cannonball solution to everything, or do we discriminate and go, no, it's only for the critical high risk incidents?
Yeah, the thing that comes to mind when you're saying that, there's a and again, I've put the transcript in Improving Safety, but there is a transcript of cross-examination of a fellow called Steve Tinks, who was a safety advisor and part of BP when the Deepwater Horizon disaster happened.
Oh, yeah.
And he was asked these questions about the terminology in the cross-examination was cutting implements on the facilities.
Yep.
And he talked about how they banned knives because people were cutting their fingers in the sack room.
Yeah.
And then the commission went on to say there was previous testimony that people couldn't get off the facility because there were no knives or cutting implements in the life rafts for people to escape.
Yeah.
And that's how I read it. And the safety manager knew nothing about that as a risk.
Yep.
And
exactly.
that really resonated with me to think, well, how many cut fingers would there have had to be on that facility before they ran something like the presidential inquiry?
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, if a person breaks a finger at work, yes, let's look after it. Let's get them medically treated. But what can we learn from that event that actually tells us something about the efficacy of the way we manage safety in the organisation? And I suspect most of the time the answer to that is nothing. Now, it might not always be the case. You might look at that and say, hang on, this represents a critical failure in one of our key processes. Maybe. But surely that's where we need to pay attention. Yeah. And I think, again, if you go to something like the Pike River Royal Commission, it talks about the failures of due diligence in that event, and it says something to the effect that the board didn't receive any information proving the effectiveness of crucial systems.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the inherent weaknesses at an executive level in most organisations is that we don't have create a conversation about what are the critical systems that we need to be concerned about. And executive attention, I think, jumps all over the place depending on what's happened today or yesterday. Instead of saying, well, is that thing relevant to the critical systems that we are concerned about or not?
Yeah. So their attention is not effectively discriminated to what's important.
Well, yeah. I mean, again, yeah. Whether you use phrase, yeah. Whether it's when you look at the cases and inquiries, it's peppered with the language of critical, crucial, fundamental, basic, important. You know, the language kind of slips around a bit, but what is it that is important from a safety management perspective that I, as an executive officer, need to be paying attention to? And I think that I don't think we've kind of landed that very well.
I think Todd Conklin put it. I think he said it. I don't know whether he's been flippant or what, when he said nobody has died of a sprained ankle or a broken fingernail. Yeah, we need to appropriately place our concentration and our focus in the correct area. And everyone's familiar with the 80-20 rule. I don't know why it's not applied so much in the safety realm. It seems to me that, from my observation of certain organizations and industries specifically, they do seem to attack every problem with a cannonball as opposed to a moderated scaled approach. Everything has to be stopped. Nothing bad can ever happen. And that term "bad" is ubiquitous, and it's used to describe everything from a broken finger all the way up to a death. There didn't seem to be any gradient in that, in that term. And I think if an appropriate gradient was used, to your point, you would have, especially the executive suite, the C-suite, you'd have them focusing on the things that matter to them as executive officers of the organization. And then you could have other people at different levels of the organization focusing on other areas which, would potentially fall more into their remit.
I think historically and culturally, David, I think there are some things that push back strongly against that kind of shift. I think the misinterpretation of things like Heinrich's triangle still has a strong resonance in safety, that if we prevent minor incidents, that will somehow have an impact. I think that's still a very strongly held belief. But probably the worst thing that we do in safety that drives this sort of behaviour is the injury rate data,
the LTIs, TRIFRs.
Yeah. I think that really drives a lot of the misapplication of effort in safety, in a way that is just, I find it so bizarre how it has taken such a hold, particularly in an Australian legal context, where none of that data is legally required. And yet it has such a stranglehold on the health and safety industry, to the point that I think I don't have science or research or anything like that, but every time I'm involved in this conversation, I can't help but think, surely that has got to be diminishing the capacity of the organisation to manage the risk in its business, just because of the time and effort that goes into things that just cannot or do not seem to have
any correlation. And for people listening here, we're talking about lost time injury rate, lost time injury frequency rate,
all of that.
And this is a number which is ascribed to an organization based on the amount of hours they work and the amount of injuries they have. And people in the safety industry here in Australia, to add context here for in Australia, because obviously Greg and I are here in Australia, they become myopic. They become very focused on trying to reduce this number to as low as they possibly can. And the downsides of that is you can reduce the number very effectively, and you can destroy any sort of effective safety culture, or any if safety culture is a thing, any sort of effective safety practices, any communication. You can just you can do more harm than good while you're in search of this elusive zero, or this number which is as low as possible. I also find it strange, but then sort of reflecting on it, Greg, in the absence of anything effective, in the absence of any effective alternatives, maybe I don't know, let's play devil's advocate, maybe this is the best of what we currently have.
So I think, and I would align with someone like Drew Ray on this. I think you are better off having no measure than bad measures, and injury rate data is a bad measure. Now, is it worth tracking injuries in your organisation? Yes, it is, because it may reveal insights or trends. Okay. I don't have a difficulty with that. But as soon as you start doing, there's two things that we do. One is that we say the number is a proxy for the efficacy of safety.
Yep.
And it is not. And we should not be doing that. And then the other thing we do is we say or we invest an extraordinary amount of time and effort to try and I'll put it at its highest. So I won't use anything pejorative here. So I won't use things like manipulate or,
Yep.
extraordinary amount of effort to try and keep that number as low as possible.
Yep.
Right. And so even if that doesn't mean manipulating and misapplying and being dodgy, it's still it still is taking resources from the organization that I think could be better placed if we weren't so caught up around the number.
Yep.
So if the number didn't matter,
Yep.
and it was simply a case, we can roughly throw them into these buckets, or even if we don't classify them, we can throw them into some certain trends so we can look for where our issues are. That's fine. That doesn't concern me. But once you start to conflate that number with safety performance, I think that's horribly problematic. And I've said this countless times in the past. You will not find a prosecution under health and safety legislation in this country ever where a defense lawyer has stood up and said, Your Honor, my client's injury rate data my TRIFR was 4.26, which is 0.4 below industry standard, and therefore they were doing everything reasonably practicable. It's just not a conversation.
At no point in time has a judge ever turned around and go, "Oh, okay, then dismissed."
Yeah, never. If you read the sentencing decision for SO Longford after the SO Longford gas plant explosion, they go through all this incredible injury rate data, all this wonderful safety awards, all these wonderful things they've done, and the judge says, well, yeah, credit needs to be given for their efforts to improve safety, but the fact of the matter is none of their systems worked on the day, and therefore I'm going to give them the maximum penalty. I'm paraphrasing a bit, but that was the outcome of it. So I just, again, the problem that I have is that I think it again takes away from the discretionary time of people that we need to have discretionary time to be doing the hard work to keep an eye on safety.
Yeah, and it does. And for anyone listening to this as well who thinks that how could it do that? I've been in many organizations, I'm sure Greg can attest to this as well, where actual bonuses for supervisors in large organizations are tied directly to LTI numbers, tied directly. And, we're talking substantial bonuses now. We're talking $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 if a department maintains or reduces their portion of the safety effort for the organization. So the overall organization can lower their LTI.
Yeah. The fact that happens still, David, is just extraordinary. I think if you go back, I think it's as far back as 1985, there's a New South Wales Industry Council report, I think it's called Digging Deeper, which basically says we shouldn't be doing that.
Right, okay.
And this is a classic. I find this, is there a role for the regulator here? Should the regulator be coming out and saying, don't do that? We do not approve of that. We think that has bad consequences because we have reports, going back decades now, which tell us we shouldn't be doing that.
But then you've got regulators telling organizations how to manage their business, which has its own problems as well. Yeah,
but it's just the preponderance of evidence and the research. This is research based, as far as I can tell. It says that we should not be linking any sort of reward or recognition program to those numbers.
Yeah, well, it's funny, because saying that here in Western Australia as well. I mean, you'll be aware of this, Greg. Safety representatives, which are essentially non-paid professionals, non-paid safety representatives, people in the organization who are interested in safety and who want to be part of it, improving safety for the organization. They keep their regular roles. If you're an administrator, you go out and you look after lawns in a park or whatever it is, you keep those roles. You're just nominated to the Safety Representative Committee, which is they meet and all that kind of stuff. It's legislated that they're not allowed to be paid. They're not allowed to receive any further compensation for that particular commitment that they make, for the extra time that they may put into that. So maybe it isn't such a big leap to say, well, we do that because we don't want people to take the role purely for the financial gain, which is, as far as I'm aware, that's the reason that they say safety reps can't be paid.
I'm not sure that they can't be. I honest, David, I don't know that off the top of my head, but regardless, I think
it's advised against.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything in the legislation, but I'm happy to go and double check. The problem in my view, and again, it's like you can't say this universally. So we know that safety representative roles get criticised in a lot of organisations because they become industrialised roles, right? So it's used to push different agendas apart from safety. We know there's a criticism of that. We know in other organisations that I've seen, safety representatives' roles get abused by the organisation because they turn them into quasi-safety officers as opposed to the conduit between the workforce and management, which the role is designed for. So I think there's a real confusion around health and safety representatives and their roles and what that role should look like. I think that's hugely problematic. And in part, and I don't know if this is how they developed historically, but in part it's almost a recognition of the failure of our ability to give supervisors the capacity to do their job. And the fact that we need this role, I think speaks to that to some extent.
Yeah.
And
it's
quite interesting. Yeah.
Look, we've been going for nearly an hour, and it's flown by for me. But I'd like to dedicate a bit of time at the end, Greg, and I've had it up on the screen for a little while so people can actually see it. But I wonder if we can dedicate a bit of time to just talking about this new book that you released. And people have probably read what's, the description there on the page: wicked problems, legal risk management, and the tyranny of metrics. Some of that we've covered today in this talk.
Yep.
What I'm always interested in this because I'm thinking about writing a book as well myself. But what motivated you to, after PaperSafe, which was a huge success, and as I said, in the intro, it definitely is becoming a staple for any safety professional who needs to understand safety management systems, the bureaucracy of paperwork within these systems as well. What motivated you to then put your time aside to write this next book, Proving Safety?
So I think, looking back, I think PaperSafe was reasonably simplistic and probably didn't go far enough, in the sense that it was, we create all of these documented systems. We have heavy emphasis on administration and bureaucracy and safety, and yet time and time again, and particularly from a legal perspective, time and time again, those processes are used against us when something goes wrong, because we write all this stuff down and it's not what happens in practice, and our workers don't understand it and they find it difficult to use the tools, and there's a whole lot of things that sit behind it. As I say, it was pretty simplistic. It offered a lot of examples of where that's happened, just to try and get people thinking about their processes. And I guess what Proving Safety was an attempt to do was to try and explain a couple of things. Explain why those kind of systems are fraught with danger, and that's really the sort of the wicked problem conversation.
Mm-hmm.
To try and explain what to try and explain what our legal obligations actually look like. So what is reasonably practical? What is due diligence? What does the case law say? What does that kind of look like in practice in terms of what we're trying to demonstrate? And how do our safety processes fail to come up to that mark? Then there was a detailed criticism of metrics, because I think that contributes largely to the problem. I think what metrics do is take away the incentive, or the incentive is probably not the right word, but let's call it incentive, to actually gain understanding.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need to understand what's going on because these green traffic lights are coming up, therefore things must be okay. So there's no incentive to think critically and analyze and look and understand.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess bundling all that up together at the end of the book, I wanted to provide a framework and to say, look, if we've got all these administrative systems, you need to be checking it. What does that mean? How do we create a space where we can do that? What is the alternative to just counting activity? What does that end up looking like? And I guess that was kind of the motivation.
Getting back to the whole conversation of qualitative over quantitative intent, as opposed to traffic light dashboards.
Yeah, what are we trying to achieve? And how does the information we generate let us know whether we've achieved it?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, writing has always, I have notebooks full of stuff, but it's always been a way to try and consolidate my thoughts and to say, how do I set this out in a way that I can not just explain and not just have a sense of, but to point to the objective evidence that sits behind it. So this is not just me saying that this is a good idea. Here's the observations and commentaries by courts and tribunals over decades and decades, which are consistent with these views.
Yep.
So that's, I think, David, that's probably the best way to describe the drivers behind it.
So that's the motivation. What do you hope to achieve?
As I said in the book, I don't think I'm going to get everybody to come the full journey with me. But there's two critical questions that arise. This is particularly in an Australian legal context, but I think it's probably universal. And that is, how do we have proper systems to manage the hazards in our business? What do we actually know about that? And what evidence do we have that those systems are in place and effective? And if they could become the critical questions that are sitting at the executive level of organisations to say, this is what we need to understand, and we need to instill in the organisation the primacy of those two questions in everything that we do, and we need to critically analyse and understand the information we receive in the context of those two questions. Mm-hmm. If I could even shift the dial slightly in that direction, I would be really, really pleased to see that occur.
That's awesome. Those two questions again, if you're listening to this, what are our critical risks? Or what are our critical controls? And how do we know that they're effective? Thank you so much for that breakdown, Greg, from your new book. Very much appreciated. I'm going to make sure all the links are down in the description below. Going to be links to the book, both Proving Safety and Paper Safe as well. And I'll put a link to Greg's company that he works for as well on there, and if you need to reach out to him.
And David, if anyone's interested in anything I've referenced in the conversation, in the cases, inquiries, anything like that, just reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to make them available.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I'll put his LinkedIn details down there. Greg, it's been an absolute pleasure, mate.
Thank you, David, for the invite. Yeah.
And I know as I mentioned at the beginning, we bump into each other a fair bit in the social circuit here in Perth. Yeah. But looking forward to catching up to you again next time, mate. Hopefully, I might pick your brains as to a bit more. I'm getting a little bit further down this road of writing my own book, so I might have to be able to, might pick your brains a little bit more about that as well, and about how I can go about doing that. But it's been an absolute pleasure today. Thank you so much for coming on. If you could hang around for just a moment, I'll just say goodbye to everybody, and then I'll come back and see you.
Thanks, mate. Take care.
You too. Well, everybody, Greg Smith. What can I say? If this proving safety is anything like PaperSafe, then it's going to be another must-have for the bookshelf for safety professionals out there. There is this point where safety meets the legal world, and it's a very big point, and it's the point at which safety systems are judged in the court of law. So we need to make sure that what we're doing in the workplace is not just effective in the workplace, but is also adequate and effective in the eyes of the law as well. And Greg is a very popular and vocal proponent of talking about this space, which you mentioned at the beginning, which is different from the safety science space, which focuses purely on the human element. And Greg is trying to bridge that gap between the legal element and the human systems element in the workspace. So my voice is on the way out. So I hope you enjoyed it, and look forward to seeing you next time. And thank you very much for coming on board and watching. Take care, everyone.